The crimson thread never ran out. By the time she understood why, it was already sewing her shut. There is a tradition in many cultures of red thread as a sign of connection. The Asian tradition of the red thread of fate, an invisible cord between souls who are destined to find each other, binding at the ankle or the finger, unbreakable across distance and time. It is, in its most common form, a comfort, evidence that we are not alone, that connection is written into the structure of things, that love has cosmological backing. The thread on the spool that Daria Voss inherited was red. It was real thread, silk, fine, the quality of it unmistakable to a seamstress's hands. It never ran out, and the connections it made between people were real, as advertised, binding their fates in the small and precise ways she applied it. It was also feeding something, the love goddess who had been reduced, by a forgetting that she suspects was not entirely accidental, to a vein of silk thread was not romantic. She was not the gentle pastel deity of Valentine's imagery. She was old, and she had always understood love in the way that very old things understand the forces they embody, as a structural energy, indifferent to the happiness or suffering of the people it moves through, interested only in connection for connection's sake. Daria was good at her work. She made connections. She charged fairly. When the thread finally ran out of other people to use, it turned to the only connection still available. Daria Voss had been a seamstress in the traditional sense. Custom alterations, wedding dress restoration, theatrical costume work since her 20s, and had built over 15 years of practice in Bristol that ran mostly by word of mouth, in the way that highly skilled craftspeople's practices tend to run when the skill is genuine and the clients feel well treated. She worked from the ground floor of a terraced house in Totterdown, with a workroom that had 2 large windows and good light and the specific ordered density of a professional space. Measuring tools, dress forms, bolts of fabric organized by weight and color, a wall of drawers for threads and notions. The spool arrived in a box from her mother's house after her mother's death in the spring, part of the larger distribution of her mother's effects. This particular box, labeled in her mother's handwriting as Nana Voss's Sewing Things, handle carefully. Inside, several items of modest sentimental value, and, at the bottom, a spool of crimson thread. The spool was wooden, the old kind, wound tight with thread of a quality that Daria assessed in the first minute as exceptional. Fine-gauge silk, the color a deep, specific red that she could not name by its dye chemistry, but which she recognized as the kind of color that holds. She checked the footage. The thread wound on the spool was roughly equivalent to several hundred meters, standard for a large spool. She set it in her thread drawer and used it 3 days later on a commission. She used it again the following week, and the week after that. After 6 weeks, she noticed the spool was neither fuller nor emptier than when she had first added it to the drawer. She checked this carefully, ran a length of thread from the spool and marked the footage, then used the spool for a full commission and remeasured. The footage was the same. She did this twice more before she accepted, with the practical orientation of a craftsperson who has encountered an inexplicable material property and decided to use it rather than resolve it, that the thread did not diminish. She began using it for everything. The first unusual report came from a client named Philippa, whose wedding dress Daria had altered in October with the crimson thread used for the interior seam work, invisible in the finished garment, structural rather than decorative, but present in the hem and bodice lining throughout. Philippa called 4 weeks after the wedding to report, with a quality of bemused delight rather than alarm, that she and her new husband had been having the same dreams. Not similar dreams, the same dream with the same content, each able to confirm the other's account of it. She found this romantic. She mentioned it because she thought Daria would find it interesting. Daria found it interesting. She began to experiment. She had clients in difficult situations, broken connections, frayed relationships, the specific damage that accumulates in any long partnership over time. She began offering, quietly and without specific explanation, a service she described to clients as a structural reinforcement, additional seaming or hemming in a garment that both members of a relationship would wear, using the crimson thread. The results were consistent. A loose stitch, a running stitch of low tension, produced shared dreams, shared emotional responses, a mild blurring of the experiential boundary between the two people involved. A tight hem, high tension, close stitching, produced something more significant, mirrored physical responses. One client and her partner, whose connection Daria had reinforced with a tight hem on a shared scarf, both developed the same headache at the same time on 3 occasions, over 2 weeks. Both independently reached for the same object in the kitchen on the same morning. Daria kept careful notes in a workbook. She labeled simply thread properties. She was good at this. The clients were almost universally grateful. The reconnection was real, the effect genuine, the cost modest. She charged fairly. She felt in the work the specific satisfaction of a craftsperson who has found a tool perfectly suited to the job. She noticed the line on her palm in the 4th month. It was fine, red, following the path of her lifeline from the base of the thumb to the wrist. Not a scratch, not a surface mark, but a thread quality line visible beneath the skin surface, red enough to be distinct from any subcutaneous structure she could identify as anatomically standard. She photographed it. She pressed it. It did not hurt. It did not move. She continued working. In the 6th month, the line had extended to the inside of her wrist. In the 8th, it had reached her forearm. She researched the thread by every avenue available to her: textile history, folklore of red thread, the academic literature on binding magic, which was thin and academically cautious and more useful than she expected. She found reference to a specific tradition, pre-Hellenic in its origins, and documented through secondary sources, of a deity whose domains included love, connection, and the specific force that binds fates. A deity that had lost worshippers to consolidation with better-known pantheons, whose name appeared in fragments as a compound of terms meaning the thread itself and the force that ties, and who is said to exist in the fragmentary texts as a vein of something physical rather than as a conventional divine form. The thread on the spool was approximately 4,000 years old. The force that had been the goddess in whatever earlier form she had occupied had been reduced by neglect, by the gradual cessation of active worship, by the specific kind of forgetting that falls on ancient things when their context erodes, to a state of material existence. She was the thread. She was the red silk. Every connection the thread made was a feeding. The energy of the binding itself, the force generated by two fates being pulled into alignment, returned to her as sustenance. Each connection made her fractionally more present. Each connection Daria facilitated made her slightly more herself again. The line on Daria's palm was not a consequence of the thread's use. It was a thread's return. The connection the thread was building, stitch by stitch, commission by commission, was not between Daria's clients. It was between the thread and Daria herself. Each use pulled a line of the thread's material through the air of the workroom and into Daria's body, following the pathways of the human circulatory system, building a network that was, in the goddess's terms, a vessel, a host for the force that had been reduced to silk and needed to fully reconstitute a living body to inhabit. Daria stopped using the thread on the day the line reached her shoulder. She stopped. She put the spool in a fireproof box. She wore long sleeves. She referred the clients she'd been serving back to their own resources. She consulted a practitioner she found through the academic literature's footnotes, a woman in Dublin who answered the phone on the first ring and listened without interrupting and said at the end, "How far has it traveled? Shoulder. Can you still make a fist with a thread-side hand? Yes. Then you have time. You need to destroy the spool. The thread itself must be burned, all of it. Simultaneously, the full spool at once. Not individual lengths. The spool, intact, in a fire large enough to consume it completely before any length can re-separate from the rest. Partial burning transfers the separated portions to the nearest warm body, which is you. Daria burned it on a Saturday afternoon in her garden, in a steel fire bowl she used for autumn leaf burning, with a fire she built from seasoned oak and let reach full temperature before she put the spool in the center. The thread burned with a specific deep red flame she had not expected, and which produced no smoke. The line in her arm did not burn. The line in her arm remained. She called Dublin the following morning and described this, and was told, with the particular careful neutrality of a practitioner managing bad news, the thread that's already in you is separated from the spool. The spool burning closed the supply. But what's already in you is already in you. Can it be removed? A pause. Not conventionally. The pathway it's built follows your circulatory system. The only exit it would use is the one it was building toward. Daria asked what exit that was. The mouth, the woman in Dublin said. The goddess's final functional state, when the network is complete, is voice. She speaks through her host. The host can hear her, but the mouth produces her words. The final stitching is around the mouth. It closes the host's own vocal production and opens the channel. Daria put down the phone and looked at her hand. The line ran from her lifeline to her wrist, to her forearm, to her shoulder, to her clavicle. From the clavicle, the woman in Dublin had described the path. Across the chest to the sternum, up the sternum to the throat, and from the throat to the mouth. She looked at her sewing kit, her own thread, in the drawer beside the now empty space where the crimson spool had been, in a dozen standard colors: white, black, gray, navy, the practical palette of a working seamstress. Good thread. Ordinary thread. She picked up the crimson spool's space in the drawer and felt, in the specific material intelligence of 15 years of working with thread, the specific absence of something that had been present and was now not, and which had been, in its absence, still present in her arm. She sat at her workbench, in her left arm, following the path the Dublin woman had described. The line was warm. She picked up a needle. She threaded it with white. And she sat in her workroom, in the good light, and began to sew. Not a commission. Something of her own, a piece she had no client for, which was unusual for her, which she was making with the focused, deliberate attention of a craftsperson doing something they need to do rather than something they have been asked to do. She did not know if it would work. She knew the logic of it, that the thread network was a seam, and a seam could be unpicked, and an unpicked seam left a channel that could be sewn closed in a different direction. She did not know if the white thread would hold. She sewed until the light went. She found the spool, used it experimentally, used it professionally, used it for 6 months before she noticed the line on her palm. She kept careful notes in a workbook labeled Thread Properties. She researched by every available avenue. She found the Dublin practitioner. She burned the spool correctly, whole, before any thread could separate. She did everything right after month 8. The question of months 1 through 8, the period of experimental use, professional application, the fair charging, and genuinely grateful clients. This is where I spend my time, because the thread worked. The connections it made were real, the benefits to her clients genuine, the craft satisfaction authentic. She was good at it. The tool fit the job. The goddess designed it to fit exactly this kind of job, to be found by exactly this kind of craftsperson, someone with the skill to use it well, the professional ethic to apply it carefully, the genuine satisfaction in good work to not stop using it once she'd started. 6 months, 200 meters of connection making, a feeding schedule if we're being precise about what it was. The white thread. I don't know if it worked. The logic is sound. Unpick the seam, sew it closed differently. But the goddess has been doing this for 4,000 years and presumably understands the mechanics of the network she was building better than Daria does. The Dublin practitioner was not optimistic, not pessimistic either, just not conventionally, which is not no. Daria was still sewing when the light went. She has good light in her workroom. She was still there when it came back. The crimson spool's space in the thread drawer is still empty. Whether what fills it next is ordinary or otherwise, I can't say. The line in her arm is still warm. Thank you for joining me tonight. My name is Alara, and I am your whisperer. I'll be here, waiting for you next time. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your stories. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more. This has been Karma Quietly Whispers. See you soon.